Engineers, what's the most ridiculous idiot proofing you've had to add in your never ending quest to combat stupid people? Someone sued the bakery I used to work at because, quote, there was no sign stating you had to take the toothpick out of the sample before you ate it. I wish I were joking, but I was the employee who offered the sample tray to her and watched her do it. We couldn't offer samples for a long time, and when we got the green light to do it again, we were told no toothpicks. We just stopped doing samples unless corporate was in town because the whole reason we put toothpicks in the samples was because people would literally sift through the samples on the tray looking for the biggest piece, and we'd have to keep tossing them out due to contamination. Story 2. We had a pedestrian bridge next to a bridge for vehicles, separated by about a 3-foot gap. The bridges were about 20 feet high over the water. So many drunk pedestrians climbed over the rails and tried to jump between the bridges and didn't make it that I was directed to design a safety net to hang between the two bridges. Story 3. I work on cars, so almost everything is designed around protecting people. My favorite is that we have to make the HVAC system louder and engine noise insulation worse because people will complain if they can't hear the systems running. We can make almost silent air ducts, but our warranty spend would go up. Story 4. My mother has OCD. She got a new Kia Sorento a few years back and loved it for how quiet it was. Until the squeaks started. I'd be driving with her and she'd say, "That, can't you hear it? It's driving me nuts." I had no idea what she was on about. She took it to the dealership and demanded they fix it. They had no idea what she was talking about. She had a mechanic sit in her car while she drove it and he couldn't hear a thing. He sat in the driver's side and drove it and actually could hear it then, but said it's just a normal noise the car makes. She went nuts. She's taken the car in to see multiple mechanics now, driven it out of town to see other dealerships, even tried to take it apart herself, all because the car was too quiet. So I feel like if you're doing all this and the lack of noise really bothers you that much, maybe it's time to get like an older, noisier vehicle. Just saying, you can have what you want. Story 5. I'm a merch intern. I walked in on my manager discussing a design with another engineer. All I heard was, so the guys will probably use that as a hammer, so I made it out of this stronger material. When they're working, they'll probably be throwing the small door open, so I used stronger hinges and added a stop. It's things like this that I really appreciate about my internship. I likely wouldn't have thought about that myself. Story 6. I worked in a call center and all the PCs were slung on straps under the desks. I'd love to know which genius came up with that idea. So people would be on the phone swinging back and forth in their chair and hit the power button. Then I'd get a ticket saying, "My modem keeps turning off." I disabled the power button from immediately shutting down the PC if you pressed it, but of course they'd get into a position sometimes where it'd be held down long enough to override it. Solution? Duct tape and a bottle cap. Once we upgraded all the PCs to new ones, I took the time to remove those stupid straps and put the PCs behind the monitor out of reach instead. Story 7. I was once introduced to the difference between an administrative solution and an engineering solution. The example given was a railroad crossing. Oddly, having wooden gates come down to block the road for an approaching train is an administrative solution, since people will drive around them. The engineering solution is to have an elevated crossing so automobile traffic cannot encounter the rails. Edit. I'm going to blame the guy from the DOE who have the presentation. We were getting training because the department decided to adopt the practice for having tiger teams from other labs. I was at Los Alamos National Laboratory at the time, circulate to do safety inspections. The administrative/engineering thing was one of two things that stuck in my memory all these years, and now I learn that it's wrong. My life was a lie. Story 8. I have one customer that takes our product, removes the battery packs, and solders them in backwards. He cuts the wires to the batteries, then solders red to black and black to red, then calls us complaining that they don't work. There's no idiot proofing that I can think of at this point. I pretty much just admit defeat now. Edit. Wow, this got big overnight. I'll answer a few questions here. We can't pot them. They have replaceable AA batteries in them. They're off warranty. Every time they come back in, we bill them. They don't seem to mind, and I'm so used to this guy's shenanigans, they don't take long to fix. That first one though, it took me forever to figure out that the power lines were reversed. It just never occurred to me. It's just not something you'd expect. I sent him an email after half a dozen or so of these came in backwards, explained how red goes to red, black to black, with pictures. only had one come in backwards after that. I've always wondered what would happen if this guy ever needed to jump his car. I've designed Rev 2 of the product, with this guy specifically in mind. They use a USB-C charge port and a Li-ion battery. No need to open it up and swap AA batteries now. We'll see how he responds to that. Big question. Why? I have absolutely no idea what this dude is trying to accomplish. Your guess is as good as mine. Story 9. Application engineer here. When handling a 3D laser scanner, it has to be placed and fixed on a stable tripod. A flat rail of a balcony is not a suitable substitute for it. And no, the insurance has not covered the total loss of the device after it fell from the 5th floor to the concrete pavement. Story 10. Industrial engineer here. You have no idea how many pointers I've had to add to the products I make. Example, I had to add arrows to a product that had two-pieced and the client could put together and remove for cleanup. It was designed so that it could only fit into one position, and it was made very obvious which position that was. Think a larger shape in a hole. No, I still had to put 2 arrows in case people couldn't tell the bigger bump could only fit in the bigger gap. Story 11. I work for the utility company, mainly in the distribution of natural gas. All of the pipelines we put into the ground are either yellow or black and yellow, and only gas is allowed to use yellow for their pipes. Some of them have natural gas printed on them in big bold letters. We put special tape about 20 centimeters above the pipeline to indicate that there's a gas pipeline below, and whomever is digging there should be careful. All these precautions and warnings, and we still get daily incidents from idiots who are digging somewhere and hit a gas pipeline. Story 12. Reminds me of one of my first design jobs. Okay, boss, I've got the design. The front footing needs to be 20 inches wide. The rear footing is 17 inches wide. So both of them are 20 inches. Why do we need a 20 inch if a 17 inch will work? Because that way we don't have to worry about the construction guys building a 17 inch front footing and a 20 inch rear footing. Story 13. This is a very common one in construction. You could design the perfect structure, every element fine-tuned to the nth degree and the most efficient structure possible. The problem is that this means every element is a different spec. It needs to be ordered separately. None of the elements align perfectly. Because they're all differently sized, the contractors spend twice as long sorting everything out on site and ensuring the correct parts are used in the correct place, and get it wrong anyway. All the way back to the fact that you spent twice as much time designing everything as you needed to. Or you can figure out the worst case elements, design for that worst case, and spec everything else the same. If it works for the worst case, by default it also works for everything less onerous. Sir, you spend a little more on raw materials, but you have more than enough money everywhere else to more than pay that back. In reality, find a nice happy medium with a few practical sizes. So having both a 20 and 17 footing may have been technically correct, but it also meant more organization and planning was needed. More chance of screwing up and needing a second digger bucket to dig the trenches. Story 14. I work remodeling small businesses. Our niche is we keep the business running while doing the remodel. I've caught people climbing over fences, ducking under moving heavy machinery, broke into locked doors, all to act surprised when we tell them this area is off limits and point to one of the 10 signs we posted. Yeah, why would you do this? What do you stand to gain outside of maybe like a cool TikTok reel that'll get you some clicks and likes, but you might potentially die? What are you doing? Story 15. Mechanical engineer. I work on systems that need to be light and durable, but the business guys want it cheap. This is a choose two sort of situation, so you can probably guess what got dropped. I can't tell you how many times I've told the operators to not intentionally drop the product from 6+ feet onto concrete. Can't get specific since it's a very niche/classified market. Story 16. An app which scans barcodes to recognize items. It runs on Android and uses the device's camera to handle the scanning bit. The number of times the question is asked, is this supported on secure cameraless devices? Or our devices don't have cameras and they don't have a barcode scanner. Can the app still work? Story 17. Years ago, I worked as a building engineer, glorified maintenance man, for an office building that had endless complaints about the AC/heater not working. The staff in the office would adjust the thermostat up and down all day, and then everyone else would complain it was too hot or too cold. It did not matter what kind of lock or cage I put on it. They would break and remove within a day or two of a new one being installed. So I got a new thermostat with a remote sensor and installed it in my office with the remote sensor near where the old T-stat was. and I left the old T-stat in place with low voltage power so that it would appear to function. Then I let them change the temp on the old T-stat all they wanted, while I programmed the real one in my office to our building standards. Poof, just like that, the complaints were reduced by 90%. I've often wondered how much of a placebo effect those visual thermostats are. Like, if you see that it's 70 degrees internal temperature, does that subconsciously trick your body into thinking that it's warmer or cooler than it actually is? Apparently that is the case. Story 18. Engineering coworker always told the story of when he used to work support at one of the leading electronic lab equipment, like oscilloscopes, companies. Engineers would call or email when a piece of hardware stopped working, and the initial support advice was to ask the engineer to, quote, check the polarity on the power cable, just in case it was, plugged in incorrectly. Story 19. I'm in the process of turning my woodcrafting hobby into a career, with every project I add to my portfolio. I've seen a lot of requests for desks that are so customized. They want everything that can't happen. They want an armrest where there's also a cup holder. They want a keyboard at this height while having a monitor at that height. All these impossible requests. I eventually sat down and thought to myself, if I was super lazy and didn't want to move them from one spot, what would make for the perfect office desk? So I made one. Got $150 from it. Story 20. This was while I was in school for electrical engineering. The prof looked at us one day and said, you can't make something 100% idiot-proof because the universe will just make a better idiot at the challenge. That has stuck with me since. Story 21. Structural engineering at an industrial facility. Switched to pipe or HSS for bracing because anything made out of angle would be immediately torched out of the way if it ever got remotely close to anything maintenance wanted to work on, since it, quote, was just an angle iron. Story 22. Not my site, but a coworker's who gave us updates at our weekly oversight coordination meeting. Back in the summer of 2016, his construction site had about a 60-foot pit on site, which was being excavated safely per all industry regs. However, it did not have 24H lighting, and there was minimal fencing around the edge. This was fine because they were only excavating during the day, and access to upper edge was blocked off and controlled, and the whole site was properly controlled and fenced off. All obligatory safety measures necessary were in play, and the laydown area was controlled. You know what else happened in the summer of 2016? Pokemon Go came out. There were 3 Pokestops on the site. He had to hire round-the-clock security so people wouldn't sneak onto the site in the middle of the night and die. Then it turns out people got clever, and you had groups where 4 people would run diversion for security while they gave all their phones to another person who would sneak onto the site in the middle of the night and run everyone's phone. So they had to hire more security to prevent this diversion tactic from working. Luckily, as everyone remembers, most people lost interest after a month and they stopped coming. When you're doing a risk plan, you think about schedule and budget. You don't think, what's my risk mitigation strategy for a breakout mobile game enticing idiots to accidentally dump their corpse on my worksite? And how much money should I set aside to manage it? Story 23. A sound engineer asked me to assist him with a funeral home's need for variable music levels to subdue loud talking in the parlor. It may seem counterintuitive, but with sensors installed, as talking grew louder in the viewing room, the computer-adjusted music became softer. Likewise, when the room for the wake was hushed, the music became somewhat louder. The director said that, quote, most people lacked common sense, good manners, and didn't know how to behave by moderating their talking levels before an open coffin. The net effect of the music's variable volume helped maintain an overall peaceful atmosphere conducive to those coming to the parlor to pay their last respects, according to the director's request. Story 24. Not too exciting, but most of the real stupid proofing ends up in labeling. Namely the IFU/DFU, user manual. The real ridiculousness happens in the failure mode effects analysis, FMEA, meetings. This is where you have to imagine every thinkable possible misuse, no matter how outlandish, and assign an occurrence score and severity score, then mitigate, often on the IFU. These meetings bring out an infuriatingly creative side from your QA people, who are otherwise the most uncreative people in the office. Story 25. I worked on an old mainframe system that we'd so sufficiently idiot-proofed that the workers started just saying, if I'll let you do it, it must be okay, instead of understanding their processes. When we replaced that system, we found all sorts of things they'd been doing against policy because no one knew it was against policy, and so no one told us to write a new catch to stop them from doing it. Then, after we replaced the system, we basically had to replace everyone because they kept just doing whatever the new system would allow, except the new system had none of those checks, so we had a few months where literally nothing was in line with policy. We had to try to explain to them that it was literally their jobs to know what the policy was and enforce it. Story 26. Way back when, I designed a product that had an optional battery module that was meant to connect to a main module. To assemble the battery module to the main module, you had to put the round peg in the round hole and the square peg in the square hole. That's it. I even put a effing sticker with instructions on the back of the battery module. Even so, we still had around 1% of clients that couldn't figure out this puzzle. One particular client had used a hammer to force the module together the wrong way, and another had tried to solder wires through the holes and pegs, and another didn't understand that he had to connect the battery module to the main module for the former to power the latter. You can't engineer around stupid. There's no worst case. It goes all the way down past 0 to minus infinity. Story 27. Aero engineer here. Someone on our team, everyone hyped up, was the most unqualified person I've ever met. 8 years experience, and they openly admitted they cheated, not just on their exams, but also on their MASC thesis. Anyways, this person didn't even know the basic equations for aerodynamics and aircraft performance, and couldn't code despite seeing the same code for years, and still couldn't use in-house tools that myself and 2 other new people learned about in 3 months on the job. This person also openly stole my presentations and work to show up in group meetings. Even forgot to swap my name at the end of the slide once. We got so tired of doing their work and spoon-feeding them stuff and the managers turning a blind eye to them and telling them stuff they should have known that we actually ended up coding in error message prompts to clue them in when they got to the same questions we answered millions of times. When that didn't click in, I actually coded in messages showing them which lines to go to find common issues. Guess what? 5 years of MATLAB and Fort Lean, they still couldn't use a debugger. I actually got personally so annoyed that I had certain error catches go to their printer and email to clue them in. I could go on for ages, but this was hands down the worst engineer I'll probably ever meet. The only thing this person was good at was sucking up to the right people and getting away with the most blatant disqualifications I'll ever see. They're doing their PhD now. So at some point, people like this will eventually get exposed, so I wouldn't even worry about it. Just, focus on you and enhancing your career, and they will get their comeuppance. Story 28. Software engineer, sort of, made parts of a website to let the customer decide where they would like holes in our product. Did not realize customers would fill a hole with a diameter of 0 every 0 millimeters. So no hole was made, and the air supply it was supposed to give did not work very well. Now, they can no longer pick 0, it has to be more, and added an extra button in case someone actually did not need holes. Story 29. Software engineer. The number of times I've had to explain that backwards compatibility can't exist for a new feature is astounding. Usually this has come in the form of new hardware is getting released and new hardware is written to support said hardware. Customers complain that old software, written before new hardware existed, doesn't behave well with the new hardware and make a stink about needing to upgrade the software, or having to update clients as well as servers, or some other ridiculous thing. Story 30. Mechanical engineer working in HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, here. I have a contractor firm that always loses the mechanical plans when we send them out. To mitigate this, I send the plans over to the primary and his boss, as well as upload them to an online cloud where they keep their plans for the projects. I've started to CC their secretary as well and label the folders, plans in here. I still get weekly panic calls from them saying they can't find the plans for different projects, and I just facepalm every time. Story 31. Software engineer here. In the organization which I previously used to work, their business model was based on supply chain. It was very hard to explain technical limitations to non-technical product managers, mostly of operations side. I sometimes used to explain them by relating to everyday things, like explaining server, or any resource as a pot or something which has a limited capacity, and you cannot fill more water/serve more requests than that. It was kind of fun. I remember once I explained them horizontal and vertical scaling by taking example of train and bus. You can attach more coaches to train to handle more requests, that's horizontal scaling, whereas you need to hire a large bus to accommodate more people that vertical. Story 32. The stupid proofing I've had to do for engineers in my company is probably only combated by the same they've had to do for me, I bet. Now, when I train people, I say, when you make guides, assume you're talking to a person who doesn't even know the most basic things. Don't write execute command blah blah, take a screenshot, circle the bar, and write type in XYZ and click enter, and so on. Same thing goes for physical things. Surely they'd shut the valve off before. No, they wouldn't do F all if it's not written explicitly in the manual, and maybe even then. On one hand, it's a bit annoying to make things stupid proof, but the way I think of it is, we all have brain freeze moments. The longer time it takes us to engineer a part or write a guide to make a process simpler is worth it if one distracted employee doesn't get hurt or make a mistake that could have been avoided. Story 33. Many years ago, I somehow became the owner of the software that was used to print out labels that would be applied to our 2-day radios, pagers, etc. There were 4 to 8 labels that would give FCC details on frequencies, details on the batteries, etc. But if the radio was going to Japan, a few of them were not to be applied. Operators were trained for this, but would too often make mistakes because there is a label with numbers and writing on it. Applying it was a quality defect, which was closely monitored. To fix it, an engineer asked me to not print the information for the Japan radios. That would produce a blank label, which should alert people not to apply it to the radio. A few months later, a quality defect appeared where someone had applied a blank label. The engineer called me back and asked if we can put "do not apply" on the labels instead of leaving it blank. I thought for a bit and said that some operator is going to apply the label that says "do not apply" anyway. Plus, we would have to print it in about 7 languages. He agreed and went off to figure out a different way to deal with it. Story 34. Electrical engineer in the building industry started putting wiring diagrams on the blueprints for how to wire emergency lighting battery packs because sometimes when I did an inspection, I would find lights that either never turned off or would go into emergency mode and drain the battery every time you turned off the lights, because someone was too stupid to not read the simple instructions that came with the battery pack. Story 35. At one of my internships, I was called Bollard Man because I personally installed over 50 bollards around the plant within 3 months in response to people nearly destroying expensive things. I think some operators think it's a personal challenge to see what they can get to fit between bollards and park and hazard zones. For the outdoor areas, I started reading into defensive architecture designs to come up with protective designs that don't actually look like bollards. Methods like planting trees and bushes, adding drainage ditches, decorative boulders, picnic benches, street lamps, walls, and so on. The kicker being, I'm an electrical engineer. It's not even remotely in my job description, lol. I've just learned that there's just no amount of signage and warnings to convince people that even though you can't see the megawatts of power flowing through the equipment, they are in fact quite deadly if damaged or misused. Story 36. I used to work as a mechanical designer at an automation company. We built pallet dispensers for warehouses. They're a big metal box where a forklift will load 40 to 80 pallets into them as a double stack, and the machine spits them out 2 at a time at the bottom for all the picking trucks. The dispenser was lag bolted to the floor. Anyway, we get a warranty complaint. The mounting bolts are broken and it keeps moving. Huh? Turns out the warehouse guys weren't slowing down to get pallets from the machine, but ramming it and using it as a brake. It was at the end of a corridor, so they had a nice long run up. We had to turn the machine 90 degrees so they couldn't build up speed and double the number of lag bolts and up the size. Story 37. Architect here, designing a food cold storage facility which needed auto-opening/closing doors between -22 degrees Celsius storage chamber and loading bay. Doors are for forklift access. Forklifts are very good at destroying doors. Worked with fork truck manufacturer, considering max speed in a straight line. Designed system of barriers at 90 degrees to doors to channel the trucks to the doors in a controlled corridor. Had photocell at start of barrier, induction loop and floor and radar above door. Length of barriers from door was such that truck could not travel length of barrier even at full speed and arrive at door without the door having opened due to any or all of the 3 triggering/sensor mechanisms. And we added in a big safety factor, and the trucks had to turn 90 degrees to get between barriers, so they weren't even at full speed when they triggered the first sensor. Took 2 days to get a door destroyed. Story 38. Not an engineer, but actually an engineering assistant. Me and my buddies, who were also engineers, decided to make a dildo ballista. Thing went over 400 FPS. It was more than enough to bust a door down. Of course, enter one of our non-engineering students, I'll call him Mike, who decided to try and wield this thing. Keep in mind, this thing was large and heavy, and it took 4 of us to even wield it properly because otherwise it was not going to be aimed right. Anyways, Mike tries to aim it and fire it off, much to our displeasure and annoyance as we told him not to, but since it didn't have a trigger or a traditional catch, and was instead shot akin to a crossbow-esque ballista, he misfired it, which the projectile ricocheted and shot him in the balls. From there, we put in a safety feature which allowed the band to catch, but it doesn't fire without a long trigger pull. Bonus: due to our new feature, we had inadvertently increased the velocity to 470 FPS. So, woot! TLDR, engineering students built a sex toy ballista. Non-engineering friend F's with it like an idiot, and we had to make an actual safety catch for it, which increased the velocity and force. You know, can you really design something like this in the first place and have the nerve to call someone else an idiot? Just saying. Come on, let's grow up, guys. Story 39. Many moons ago, I managed a support function in cybersecurity that included a sysadmin group. They had gotten lazy and were repurposing laptops throughout the organization without properly updating them and removing the previous user's files first. So I had them go through a 2-step process of wiping the laptop and putting on a fresh build from corporate to make sure they were up to date and didn't include any prior user's data. We built custom boot disks that were to be used for the wiping. They were printed on storage blank DVD-Rs, which we paid extra for. They were only available to sysadmin staff. The staff were explicitly told, and writing was on the desk, to never boot a machine with a disk unless the intent was to wipe the machine and start from scratch. And the scripted process had several very loud and garish screens warning, "This will delete the entire hard drive irreversibly. Do you want to continue?" Despite all of this, we were forced by audit to have the machines log on to the corporate network first, and then query the sysadmin for their SSO password before wiping the machine. Why? Because despite all that, 3 machines had been inadvertently wiped. Those people are the reason you get warnings on Windex bottles. Story 40. I'm not an engineer, but a heavy equipment mechanic. We have one very big garage door on the side of our building. There are 2 large signs on either side of the door in English and Chinese, big customer base, that say "Do not enter." A line painted on the ground that says "Stop, do not enter" in it. A 4-foot by 10-foot orange sign that says "Customer Entrance" with arrows pointing to the front of the building, with arrows painted on the ground also going to the front of the building, and a chain that hangs across the doorway with another sign that says "Staff Only." I wish I was kidding when I tell you that even with all that, at least 2 people a day walk into the shop and are genuinely surprised when they're confronted. My favorite one was the dude who literally hit his head on the sign, clanging from the chain as he ducked under it, then argued with me for 5 minutes about how he's there to pick up his machine. Like, dude, do you see a desk with a cash register? When you go to McDonald's, do you go in the back where they keep the dumpster and demand service? The hell is wrong with you people? Story 41. Late to the party, but here goes. A grad-level supervisor poorly cleaned a chem station and proceeded to eat his lunch at that station. The previous students working on that station were working with a cyanide compound. The lab supervisor suffered but didn't die. During a company freeze, a systems architect fat-fingered a script and pushed a global software update that forced a reboot to all domain servers internationally during a live demo of a product to board of investors. This is one of my top favorites. A director level constantly complains about slow laptop. Security team advised him to stop going to suspicious sites, in which he angrily yelled at them that all he does is work while he's home. Then the IT team would have to re-image his laptop. This happened about 5 times. Then the director of security got involved and in front of everyone showed how he was watching adult content from multiple shady sites and exactly when he clicked on Start Webcam Now, he got infected. He thought cleaning his history was enough to hide his footsteps. By the way, if you work for a top 50 Fortune 500 companies, you sign off on all your data privacy rights when using IT equipment. There are many advanced tracking software that tracks every single character you type, every website you go to. Clearing cookies and history will not help you. There are rules to protect your privacy to a certain degree, but if the company ever needs to create a case against you or to collect proof, they can fully audit you so easily. I'm no longer in this field, but I will tell you, there are so many sick people out there. Story 42. Instrument guy here. We had a chemical contact chamber with a very complex cascade control system. There were about a dozen controllers interacting and indicating. The head operator would constantly adjust knobs and screw up the process. Eventually, we decided to shut the whole system off and just use one analyzer, one valve, and one controller because it worked better. Before we put the thing back in service, we wired the controller input so the meters jump around when the operator turns the knobs. None of it did anything. He would go every day and move knobs and watch meters until he eventually retired. We set the only working controller at the correct set point and put an out-of-service label on it. Story 43. Just in general, the insane size and quantity of warning labels that have to be all over everything, like a riding lawnmower. If you don't know that blades are sharp, mufflers are hot, and you shouldn't stick your hand into moving belts, you have to be a real idiot. To be fair, it's mainly so that if you do hurt yourself, the corporate lawyers can say, "We told you not to do that," but it ruins the aesthetics of a lot of equipment. Moreover, it causes people to ignore things that should actually be warnings, because now the paradigm is that every warning is just painfully obvious BS. Story 44. Worked on the railroad, EU, and the safety rules are crazy sometimes. Imagine every time someone gets hurt, they make a new rule or try to prevent it in other ways. No room for common sense or logic. So electric trains run on those power lines above the track. Scary, angry pixies live in the power lines, and of course, some people want to meet them, or do by mistake when climbing a train. So one year they decide, we need yellow danger signs everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Not just trains and wagons, but every power line post, 60 meters apart, feet by 3, every bridge, and they all need cleaning. As to the engineering, every kind of post needs its own design, depending on the dimensions of the post, materials like iron, galvanized concrete, plastic spacers, and grounding, to avoid buildup from the magnetic field. A sticker is not good enough for the world of bored railroad engineers. Most could be installed with the same new tension, perfect installment tool they invented, so that's something. Maybe one day this saves a life, and all the time installing and cleaning these signs will be worth it. But I bet the guy is going to earn his Darwin Award some other day. Story 45. Not me personally, but in a different module in a factory I used to work in, a guy stuck his hands into a heated acid vat to grab material he had dropped. His PPE saved him from chemical burns, but he did end up with second-degree burns. I saw their modules process engineer walking around our area and looking at the acid vats. He said he was considering putting up "Don't stick your hands in the acid" signs up, and we joked about "No swimming" signs instead. Story 46. In the vein of social engineering, I was part of an emergency management in and around the zombie trend at the time. As part of in-house revisions, I started including zombie tie-ins to general purpose and awareness. It made buy-in jump significantly that helped stupid proof real situations by simple participation and meme reinforcement. Story 47. Long before the eponymous Murphy installed a set of sensors backwards so they didn't work, our Buckminster Fuller wrote an essay in prose about control by adequate design of misuse. The short name for the process is don't proofing. Working in a customer-facing position, just engineering a space so people are able to figure out how to navigate it is impossible. You can design for 98%, but there's always a persistent 2% that will actively thwart everything you put in place to prevent their blunderings. Even if you literally stand at the door and tell each person personally what to do, not do, or expect, 2% will immediately ask or do the opposite of what you just said and get all agitated at you at the results. Case in point, when COVID hit, the office at my auto shop closed and all business was done outside. I put up 3 day-glow neon-colored signs saying to not enter the office. Months into the shutdown, huge numbers of people were still going in, so I started an experiment to see if there was a number of signs that was enough to get the 98% up to 99.5%. Every time someone went in, I added another do not enter sign. It got up to 9 signs before I gave up and took down all but the original 3 before losing the last shreds of hope for humanity. There were signs taped over the middle handle you'd have to grasp and wrinkle. Didn't matter. A chair placed in front of the door, again with 2 bright do not enter signs you'd have to grasp and move the chair. 2 pictograms and even a blow-up of a Gandalf "You shall not pass" meme. The same persistent 2% could not be swayed or changed. When I went to Mother's Day brunch with my mom right after her county first reopened for outdoor dining, she did the same thing and I wanted to explode. The hostess told us, "We're going to walk through the restaurant to the outdoor patio now." My brother and I walked through, but my mom stopped in the doorway and spun around, causing the hostess girl to have to jump back and catch the door again, and says in an annoying sing-song voice at a casual conversational pace, "Oh, so I guess we're eating inside?" Story 48. I'm not an engineer, but I can relate to this. Was working on a website redesign in 2020, and one of our head salespeople providing input for a specific market told us to include something above the fold to tell people to scroll down. Our whole dev team ignores this request because who the hell needs to be told to scroll down? We now have a header that says scroll down for more resources because people seriously could not figure it out. Story 49. Back in the day, I was an IT engineer in the Army. I was given the task to write procedures that anyone could follow. I spent a couple days on the procedure to ghost, reset, laptops that had been in the field. The Sarge got this guy to test it without any help. First step was, connect the laptop to the switch with an Ethernet cable and confirm the light goes green. Dipstick used 2 separate unconnected cables and tried for 30 minutes to work out why the light wasn't green. He had 6 months of IT training. At this point, Sarge turned to me and said, "You failed," and walked out laughing his head off. Story 50. Outside plant engineer here. In 1996, we were put on all hands Fix Utah project. The Olympics were coming, and all of Utah's planners and engineers were working on that, and we were to pick up the slack on the day-to-day jobs that needed to be worked. I had finished one job, a simple buried straight-line copper distribution, no big deal. I finished it up, and they told me to run it by Randy, the senior OSP engineer from Utah. I got the job back with a note to allocate money for custom armored plating for the pedestals, the green ugly things in your front or backyards. Why? Because apparently the locals use them for target practice, and the armor had to withstand a direct hit from a 30-06. Never had to do that anywhere else I worked, but I haven't worked everywhere. Yet. Story 51. Our head engineer would be sent off to other companies in the group to troubleshoot problems for them that they couldn't solve. One of his sites had a problem of red plastic pieces in the finished product, like plastic bag material. He's flown from Europe to Asia to investigate. It was a powder mix that was being created by blending other powders together. He gets to site, they show him the end of the line where this red stuff is coming out in the product. Naturally, he goes to the start of the process to work his way through eliminating causes. First thing he sees at the start of the line is a worker chucking bags of ingredients into one of the hoppers. The bags were red and plastic. He takes a closer look. They've built a shredding mechanism on top of the hopper, so that the worker just has to chuck the bag in the hopper and the shredder will rip it open. This logic here was to save time not having to open the bags. He asked the site manager if they were having him on, i.e. taking the piss, and they weren't. They literally couldn't connect the dots that this was the source of the red plastic pieces. The solution was to stop doing that. Story 52. We had the side doors to our office refitted with keypads to make it easier for employees to go in and out while maintaining a locked egress point. People would have to move the interior handle to keep the door unlocked so they wouldn't have to input their code. They would leave it unlocked at night, causing security issues. So I put tape on the lock and a note saying, "Leave door locked for security reasons." 2 days later, I see tape moved and door unlocked. I then hot glue the lock and put tape on it with another note, "Door is to remain locked as per company policy. Failure to do so will result in disciplinary action." 2 days later, tape is moved and hot glue has been dug out. Word is manager on that side of the building authorized employee to open the lock again. Now I'm pissed. Respect my authority. I take a chisel and hammer to the lock portion into the body of the door handle, superglue the interior, encase outside in epoxy, cover in tape, and place a note on door. Failure to abide by company policy has forced this. Any attempt to bypass the closing and locking of this door will be met with termination by owner's name. 2 days later, there's a effing block holding the door ajar, which I noticed when I left late and saw light coming out of the door. I bolted the effing door shut and had all fire exit signs moved and told fire inspectors it was due to structural damage. Story 53. Software developer wrote a program for checkout at a store. If someone entered an incorrect product to the cart, there is an option to remove it. All items in the cart were numbered, and if you wanted to remove one, it would ask you, which line do you want to remove? Once you entered the value, I'd do some error checking, like is the value greater than 0? Does the line actually exist? Etc. Well, turns out I get a call saying it's crashing when they try to remove a line. I ask what they're doing and they say press the button. The thing pops up asking which line. They enter the first one and it crashes. I try a million things on my end and I can't reproduce the issue. So I drive up to the store, 1 hour long drive, the day before Christmas and ask the employee to show me. Turns out she was literally entering the first one. quote-unquote on the text field, rather than just 1. I lost so much faith in humanity, but also learned an important lesson. People are effing stupid, and you need to account for that in software. I told her to enter the number. She was baffled, like she didn't know why it didn't occur to her to try that. I fixed it 2 days later, Ali G, with every other text field. Yeah, when it comes to writing instructions and showing people how to do things, you need to be as specific as possible. It's always better to over-explain than assume that your audience knows anything at all. Story 54. X is a civil engineer. He had to go to court because one of the trash truck workers wouldn't stop eating the salt they laid out for snow. He literally had to go talk about why it isn't safe to eat and how he'd put up literature saying as much. The lady kept eating it, got sick, and tried to sue the city. She tried to say that working was making her eat it unintentionally, but nobody rides on the back of the truck when they're spreading salt. She was going back there and eating it on her own. She also got caught on camera eating it, back at the base. Story 55. Ever remove a computer case and find a burrito in it? One of the workers would hide his food in the case because they weren't supposed to have food at their workstation. Well, he must have forgot it because we opened this computer that wasn't booting up properly to a full biome of insect life and what I think was green and black mold growing over the motherboard. We chucked it. Guy who it was assigned to got fired because he already had several warnings for spilling drinks on peripherals or leaving crumbs around his workstation. Who puts a burrito in a computer and forgets it? Burritos are delicious. Also, computer innards are dusty. Don't put food in there. Story 56. A gotcha stick is used when making fencing for machines to check how far people can reach into the fencing towards moving components and whether what you have is stupid proof or intentional proof enough. There's also a specific company that demands the screws used to put fencing together around machinery are safety type so that common tools can't take the fencing apart. Like they had issues with that before it was a rule. Story 57. Kim E. Maybe not the most ridiculous, but might be my favorite story. We used a nuclear level sensor to measure how full a hopper was in a highly flammable environment, so we didn't need to cut any penetrations in the side of the system and potentially leak solvent vapor. The nuclear source in these systems is encased in a heavy-duty lead box. We had to add half-inch thick stainless steel shroud around the back of the source after we walked in one morning to find hammer marks all along the outside of the box. The hopper had accumulated some buildup during the night, and the operator couldn't think of a better place to pound on to break it up than the nuclear source. Story 58. Civil engineer here. I had a project which involved the removal of 3 very old, very grand oak trees. The city zoning department's condition for removal of the trees was that the wood be preserved and used to make conference tables for the business college building being constructed on the site. We did all the legwork for the contractor. I spent weeks coordinating how big the pieces should be, where to store the pieces, and how to cut them. Even went so far as to put a phone number on the plans for the person at the college who would be responsible for moving and storing the wood after the trees were cut down. The contractor cut the trees down and immediately fed them through the wood chipper. Story 59. Not an engineer, but worked for a fireplace company when they had to start adding big stickers on our gas and wood fireplaces that say, paraphrased but not far off, "Caution, fireplace extremely hot when in use." They were sued all the time for people getting burned for things such as, but not limited to, touching burning logs, fireplace tools sold separately, allowing children to place hand on fireplace glass, gas, melting/breaking TVs that were mounted on top without proper clearances/hardware, burning house down, or other damage from admitted misuse. To give some context to the last one, storing dry wood in front of the fireplace, storing camp fuel in plastic containers in front of the fireplace, changed log placement, gas, then discovered soot all over their room. You must do it the way they say, period. Tried to use the wrong gas type, LP/NG. There are many more, but it got me the most. There are folks out there who don't realize that fire is hot. Story 60. Designed a wireless industrial data collection system. I got the cost down to under $5 a unit with good supply lines. It's not a consumer product. It is about the size of a power adapter and is never meant to be seen or serviced unless it breaks. It was a solid engineering victory. Went and bought different colored cases because I predicted the CEO would ask why it didn't come in different colors. Then make us go back to the drawing board. It did in fact happen, and I had several cases ready. I pointed out that the black one looked the best and he bought it. Fortunate because the supplier only made black and beige cases, and they were all out of beige. So I idiot-proofed a project proposal by adding colorful case options to the prototype. Was a nice little Dilbert moment. Story 61. Marine engineer here. Power tools are constantly going missing from our workshop. There are only 10 people that have access to them. It drives my boss mad. He's always kicking off about things going missing. I suggested a sign out and in sheet for the expensive stuff to him and to restrict who has access to the keys. His response? I'm not using a sign out sheet. You are all grown men and can look after tools. A week later, 2 more drills have gone missing, and he's done nothing but complain that we can't look after our tools properly. Guess what? He's now suggested a sign out and in sheet, which was, of course, his idea. You know, there are a lot of battles to pick and choose throughout life, and this ain't one of them, my friend. Just let him have the victory. He clearly needs to have his ego fed here. Story 62. My dad worked for a computer networking company back in the 80s, and one site kept requesting help as the network would shut off and needed to be rebooted every night at about the same time. No matter what they tried, the system invariably shut down the same time in the middle of the night. Finally, they sent a tech out to physically watch the machine at the appointed time. Promptly, the janitor came in and unplugged the computer to plug in their vacuum. Story 63. I'm a chemical engineer and designed a small system that went onto a customer site to test a process. One day, the customer wanted to do a photo shoot to show off the new kit. The system includes a lot of pumps, and each has an independent motor drive mounted next to it with a small LED screen. When turned off, this screen reads, "Stop." Now, the process had not yet finished commission and was empty and not hooked up to anything except electricity. An important fact is that you should never run a pump without liquid. It'll destroy the rotating parts. PR lady did not like the stop on all screens, so asked a technician to turn them on. I had told this guy beforehand it's empty and basically just for show. He told her this, but she ignored it and told him to do it anyway. Next day, I get a phone call saying the entire thing is broke and spewing smoke from all the burnt rubber in the pumps. Story 64. When I was a field engineer for an automation firm, we had to install a light curtain, industrial version of the laser tripwires you see in heist movies, around the base of a hydraulic scissor lift. Apparently, they had a similar system at another plant where some dude thought that hiding under that lift to take a nap was a great idea. Yes, the system was running. No, he did not wake up before it came back down. Story 65. Electrical engineer here. The amount of people that use the heat sink on a piece of equipment to warm their lunch is astounding. I've been called out to many Fortune 50 companies and secure DoD installations to troubleshoot overheating systems and find melted and burnt cheese covering the heat sinks. At more than one site, the facility crew was waiting around with their lunch boxes, hoping I'd fix it in time for them to be able to cook up their lunches. In one case, they had a whole pot of Texas chili ready to warm up on it. Story 66. Systems engineer here, probably the least bona fide professional posting, but I've got some stories. Around 2009, I was working a contract to upgrade an unstable system. Bad-minded IT admins were shutting down high-availability servers whenever something went wrong. The IT upgrade was already bought by the time I arrived, and the system was overdue despite the following narrative. Overall, my perspectives and very presence were met with resistance, and I didn't have time to teach them why reading logs is a good thing or how to begin doing so. At first, I removed the start menu options to shut down or restart on several relevant servers, only to find that they were using the chassis power buttons all along. So I figured out how to make the boxes appear to turn off but not actually shut down. They'd press the power button and it would turn off the screen and do nothing else for 60 seconds. The button press just sent me an email to advise me of their AirSAS solution. Run the blank screensaver and count to 60. At 61, it would turn the screen back on. Again, these weren't end users. These were administrators. There were many reasons why this shouldn't have worked, why this ruse should have been obvious. The only direct feedback I recall getting from their team was that it seemed faster. Good times. Story 67. I had to make a warning label for a large industrial ripsaw designed, which explained that the DC injection brake wouldn't work if you turned off the main disconnect. The label was in response to someone turning off the main disconnect, sticking their hands in the saw blade pit without looking, and cutting off a few fingers. Apparently, looking at the blade to see if it was still spinning was too much to ask. Story 68. I've been designing complex systems for 16 plus years. I could write a book on this subject. There's always some level of moaning and groaning when a system you design goes through the risk assessment process, and people point out, we need extra guarding here, and here, and here, and there, and here. One time I had to add 8 feet of light curtains in front of a system so that, quote, operators can't get a running start and jump through the opening to the machine. I called that the Superman rule, which is in excess of all OSHA requirements. The sad part of that one is that someone did, indeed, Superman through while the system was running, which promptly mangled them and nearly cut them in half. Yes, they died. We had all of our documentation in line, and every box was checked, so it was ruled as an intentional circumvention of established safety devices. On another system, I had to design in an automated cup holder for operators, complete with through-beam sensor. Why? Operators are known to throw garbage and pour drinks into systems to create downtime, so they could get more break time while maintenance was fixing the machine that mysteriously broke. The cup holders would only release people's drinks during designated break times. I had a little PTSD when I played Wolfenstein New Colossus in the level where you have to intentionally break your machine to stage a distraction in prison. The worst one I ever sat through in terms of, seriously, what kind of idiot would, was when I was designing a system for a certain auto manufacturer. It was a large system that was responsible for assembling and welding all sorts of variants across the entire line up of 100K plus vehicles. The components being welded were held in place by spring-loaded pins with complex geometries. I spent a considerable amount of time designing the pins so that you couldn't load them incorrectly, matching the geometry of the mating part. These poke yokes were expensive to begin with. After about a month of the system running at the customer's facility, the customer wanted me to add additional poke yoke features to the pins so they couldn't be installed in the wrong location and wrong machine. The fact that the part geometries wouldn't line up if you put the wrong pin in the wrong place was irrelevant. Certain operators were ramming these things into the wrong holes and causing system crashes. Mind you, this takes serious effort to do, to the point of cracking the parts. So across 9 of these systems, which I designed, I had to have 9 by 7 equals 63 unique pin designs. I accomplished this by having slots machined in and clocked in certain orientations, so they were essentially keys at this point, and cost upwards of $1,500 each to machine. 64 RC A2 hardened pins and D2 locating dies. Hard stuff. A few weeks later, all of the pins were machined, assembled, and delivered to the customer. I get a phone call that same week and was told, quote, "You need to get here. We can't run the systems." I got in my car, drove out to meet the customer. Their executive director was standing in the lobby waiting for me. We walked out to the systems, and I was told that my design, quote, jammed up the systems and is holding up production for the entire vehicle line, costing $30,000 per minute. We walked up to the first system, and sure enough, the pins were completely stuck in the dies. What the hell? I designed these things with a 0.003 inch MMC gap. It should be smooth like butter, and I tested every one myself before we shipped them. Every pin was jammed. The director was furious. I pulled up the assembly drawings and proved that the designs and tolerances were sound. I couldn't pull these things out, but I noticed the tops of the pins were crowned over, like someone had been smashing them with a 5-pound sledge. We continued walking to the other systems, and as we approached one, we heard a banging sound. Their maintenance lead was standing in front of one of the systems with a large hammer, absolutely wailing the pins in place. The director grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around, and said, "What in the F are you doing?" The maintenance guy said, "The pins don't fit." I picked up one of the pins he hadn't mashed, showed him the keyed feature, pointed out the engraved ID on the corresponding receiver die, and demonstrated that they fit absolutely perfectly fine when you mate them with the correct assembly. Oh, and it was color and number coded too. The director turned to me, said, "Quote me a new set," and stormed off. Story 69. Not me, but a coworker technician of mine. We needed a gasket of some kind put on one of our instruments. The metal bits were expensive and would take a few days to arrive. Instead of waiting, coworker took 2 Canadian quarters, as we were in Canada, drilled a hole through the middle that matched the gasket and stuck it in place. A 50-cent repair, and I think it's still there, a decade later. Story 70. I had to idiot-proof a UPS because of a terrible design rather than idiot users. The power button was on the front at hip height and stood out from the surface, so if anyone bumped into it, the room instantly went eerily quiet. What idiot designed that? We made a thick plate with a button-sized hole in it so you could lean on it all you liked, but anything smaller than a fingertip wasn't going in. Story 71. IT teacher in high school loved to tell this anecdote when we got into programming and best practices. Always assume the dumbest possible user. Once you're done programming, try to intentionally brick everything and find ways to stop yourself. Our school had a library that was operated by volunteers, usually people's moms. They had a small desk with a PC at the entrance to log stuff and help kids print out things and such. One day, some kid asked one of them to print something from his USB stick. And what happened next must have traumatized this little guy for the rest of his life. The mom somehow managed to force the USB stick into the floppy drive, with so much force that our IT teach had to take the PC apart to get the USB back. The floppy drive didn't make it. Idiot proofing was basically that there no longer was a floppy drive to violate, and that new library moms would now also get training on how to use a USB stick, including how to identify a USB port.